In 1847, a Methodist revival camp in rural Pennsylvania promised salvation. By spring, 278 women had vanished without a trace. The church said they had ascended, but no graves were ever found, no records, no return. Over the next 170 years, that disappearance became a ghost story until a stolen journal, a sealed chamber, and a forgotten cross brought the truth crawling back into the light. This isn't folklore. This is what happens when faith is weaponized, and obedience becomes a sentence. You're about to hear the story they tried to erase. But some women never stay buried. Between 1847 and 1853, an eerie silence spread across the forested ridges of western Pennsylvania. A silence shaped not by nature, but by the sudden disappearance of 278 women wives, daughters, sisters, who had entered religious revival camps and never returned. They didn't die. They didn't run away. They simply vanished, as if the land had swallowed them whole. Their names were erased from church registries, their belongings quietly donated, and their loved ones consoled with cryptic reassurances that the women had been called to higher service by the Lord. For more than a century, this unsettling chapter remained hidden, buried under layers of theological rhetoric and bureaucratic forgetfulness, until a demolition crew in 2019 disturbed something beneath the decaying floorboards of an abandoned religious encampment near Clearfield County. Whatever they found was so disturbing, local authorities locked down the entire site for 3 months. Official explanations were vague. Whispers, however, said that what emerged from that shadowed soil threatened to rewrite everything we thought. We knew about America's religious heritage. 3 separate denominations normally, divided by doctrine, rushed to silence the discovery. Unlikely allies, they united to suppress the truth that a belief system had once taken root so corrupt and powerful, it drew hundreds of women into its grasp and erased them from existence. But the truth has a way of clawing its way back from the dirt. And it begins not with the women who vanished, but with the man who made it all possible, a preacher known only as Brother Ezekiel Mordecai. In the spring of 1847, the hills of Appalachia were crackling with religious fervor. Locals called it the Great Stirring, a revival unlike the structured movements of the Second Great Awakening. This wasn't born in pulpits or polished pews. It festered in remote hollows, where traditions twisted together Christianity, tangled with folk rituals, old-world superstitions, and shadowy doctrines that made seminary professors shudder. Western Pennsylvania, thick with pine and oak, was a land that seemed designed to hide secrets. Small communities, descendants of German Lutherans, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and Welsh Methodists had settled there decades earlier. By 1847, their faith had morphed into a strange spiritual hybrid. Fed by isolation and hardship, it was fertile ground for a charismatic stranger to plant dangerous ideas. That stranger was Brother Marai, who emerged from the wilderness as if summoned by the forest itself. He claimed to have studied at Princeton Theological Seminary, though no official record could confirm this. According to him, God had spoken to him in visions while he wandered the mountains alone. But none of that mattered to the people who heard him preach. Because when Brother Marai raised his voice, people collapsed in tears, spoke in tongues, and claimed to see heaven open above them. He was said to heal the sick, foretell storms with eerie accuracy, and most chilling of all, read the condition of a soul as if flipping through a book. His power was not in his knowledge, but in his presence. He offered something they didn't know they'd been missing, a God who demanded obedience but offered transcendence. His message? That modern Christianity had been diluted, corrupted by institutions. Only through absolute surrender to God's will, as interpreted through divine vessels like himself, could one be truly saved. He named this movement the New Light, a reference meant to evoke past revivals, but wholly distinct from them. This was no rebirth. This was a revolution in robes. That summer, Marai oversaw the building of a remote religious camp perched atop a plateau northeast of what would become Clearfield. The site was hand-picked for its seclusion. A winding 3-mile trail through dense forest was the only way in or out. Local families offered timber, supplies, and sweat, believing they were erecting a spiritual sanctuary. The camp's layout followed Marai's exact specifications. At the center stood a darkened log hall, its interior intentionally dim to focus. The worshippers inward. Around it were cabins for families, a longhouse for unmarried women, and carved into the hillside, like a cave Brother Marai's private retreat. All of it encased within an 8-foot-high fence. The stated purpose was protection from bears. But no bear had ever needed such elaborate fortification to be kept out. Or in. Among the first to join were the Weatherby's Pennsylvania Dutch, farmers who had buried 2 children the previous winter. Sarah Weatherby, 34, mother of 6, would become the first to vanish. Marai claimed she had been chosen for divine translation, a spiritual elevation that required her to leave earthly attachments behind. Her husband Abraham seemed to accept this explanation without question. Her children, however, continued to ask when she would come back. Life inside the camp followed strict guidelines. Men and women lived separately, except during worship. Personal property was communal. Absolute obedience to Brother Marai's spiritual insights was non-negotiable. He alone, they believed, could interpret God's will for each soul. But there was something else. A doctrine not publicly preached, only whispered about among the inner circle. The belief that certain women young, pious, and spiritually sensitive were chosen to serve God through something called spiritual elevation. These women were quietly prepared, isolated, and then led through a ritual known as the Night of Revelation. Afterward, they were never seen again by winter of that year. 43 families, nearly 180 people lived within the camp. It was self-sufficient. They farmed, sewed, educated their children, and interacted minimally with outsiders. Law enforcement in those days was thin in the Appalachian Hills, and religious groups were left alone as long as they caused no trouble. The new light camp paid its taxes. It seemed peaceful, even wholesome, but below the surface, something was beginning to stir, a hunger disguised as holiness. 3 months after Sarah Weatherby's disappearance, her sister Mary came to the camp to ask what had happened. She left that same night, pale and shaken, abandoning all her possessions. She never spoke of what Brother Marai had told her. And then, on January 15th, 1848, during a Night of Revelation ceremony, a young bride named Rebecca Stoltzfus walked to the altar with glassy eyes and a tranquil smile, and never returned. The community was told she had ascended. Her husband was told to rejoice. But not everyone rejoiced. Some began to whisper, and those whispers would soon ignite a fire that even Brother Marai's holy doctrine couldn't extinguish. The day Rebecca Stoltzfus disappeared began like any other in the new Light Methodist Camp, with hymns echoing through pine-covered slopes and the scent of firewood clinging to the cold morning air. But for those paying close attention, something about that day felt strange charged, as if the wind itself held its breath. Rebecca had been different all week. A radiant sort of calm clung to her like a second skin. She wandered the camp barefoot, murmuring to herself and spending long hours in the meeting hall alone. She claimed she was seeing visions, not of angels, or clouds or paradise. No, her visions spoke of surrender, of walking through fire and becoming light. To some, her behavior seemed holy. To others, unsettling. Her husband, Jacob, had tried to talk her down from whatever spiritual cliff she was teetering on. They had only been married 3 months. He loved her with a simple, sturdy affection, the kind that built cabins and waited patiently through long winters. But now she felt far away, unreachable. Then came the summons. Brother Marai called it a night of revelation. It had been building for weeks, private consultations between him and select women, increasingly fervent worship, hushed conversations among his 3 assistants. The congregation had felt it coming, even if they didn't know what it was. That evening, under a moonless sky, the entire camp gathered inside the dim log-walled hall. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows that made the wooden beams appear to breathe. Rebecca sat near the front, dressed in white, eyes closed, face serene. Brother Marai entered without ceremony, walking slowly to the front. His voice, when it came, was deep and steady. "Tonight," he said, "a soul is called." He spoke of Abraham's obedience, of prophets who walked willingly into the unknown, of how complete surrender was the only path to divine elevation. The air in the room grew thick. People began rocking, speaking in tongues, some collapsing in what they believed were holy trances. Then Marai lifted a hand. "Come forward, Sister Rebecca." She rose like someone hearing music no one else could hear. Her steps were slow, trance-like. Jacob stood to reach for her, but an assistant gently pushed him back down. Brother Marai placed his hands on Rebecca's shoulders and muttered something in what he called sacred tongue, a language no one else recognized. Then he turned to the congregation and proclaimed, "She has been chosen." Rebecca opened her eyes, her voice steady, almost joyous. "I go to serve the Lord in whatever he requires. Do not mourn me. This is not death, it is birth." The congregation erupted in fervent prayer as Rebecca was led away into the dark toward Marai's retreat. And just like that, she was gone. By morning, there was no sign of her. Her clothes had been redistributed, her name erased from camp records. Her husband Jacob was told that she had been translated, just like Enoch taken by God to a higher plane. Her cabin was given to a new family. Her wedding ring now belonged to another bride. Jacob was expected to accept this with reverence, but Jacob was not like Abraham Weatherby. He did not quietly bow. That night, he tried to sneak into the wooded area behind Brother Marai's quarters. He brought a lantern and a knife. But 2 of Marai's assistants, the so-called vessels of light, intercepted him. They didn't threaten him. Instead, they offered calm rebukes. "You must not let doubt consume you," one whispered. "Your faith is being tested." When Jacob protested, they took his tools from his workshop and placed them in the camp's shared storage. His status as a married man no longer applied. His bed was reassigned to the single men's dormitory. And just like that, he was reabsorbed by the collective. But Jacob wasn't the only one unsettled by Rebecca's disappearance. Martha Brennan, a 45-year-old widow and longtime member of the camp, had noticed a pattern emerging. The women chosen for elevation were always between 16 and 40, always beautiful, always emotionally vulnerable or recently bereaved, always intensely devoted to Marai. She had also begun noticing other things, like how the chosen women became passive in the days leading up to their disappearance, as if something had hollowed them out. They no longer spoke of joy or faith or salvation, only of duty, of obedience. Martha approached Brother Marai with her concerns during a worship break. His response was a sermon the following Sunday, an attack without naming names. Doubt, he preached, is Satan's whisper. It begins as curiosity, but ends in rebellion. He warned the congregation that those who question God's instruments are questioning God himself. The result was immediate. Martha became an outsider. People avoided her. Conversations stopped when she approached. Children were told not to linger near her. She had become, in the eyes of the camp, infected with UNBELI. Jacob was reassigned to latrine duty. Both were being punished. Still, the whispers didn't stop. They just went underground. Women gathered in pairs behind the laundry shed at the edges of the prayer fields, speaking in half sentences and knowing glances. They started counting the empty cabins, started noticing how each elevation ceremony followed the same rhythm, the same rituals, the same silences. February came, and with it, the elevation of Anna and Elizabeth Kaufman, sisters in their early 20s. March brought Mary O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who had arrived with elderly parents and too many scars on her soul. Each time, the process was the same. A period of spiritual preparation, followed by a night of revelation, and then erasure. No records, no graves, no farewells. The camp had become a machine of forgetting. Every protest was interpreted as a test of faith, every doubt a spiritual defect. The women learned to keep quiet. They began speaking in code, watching each other for signs of being chosen. More chilling than anything was the camp's doctrine of sacred silence. Brother Marai taught that speaking of the elevated women was dangerous, that it interfered with their spiritual missions and could pull them back to the earthly realm. The doctrine served one purpose: to isolate every questioner, to turn grief into guilt. At the heart of it all were Marai's three assistants: Jeremiah Whitmore, the smiling face who communicated with the outside world; Samuel Brennan, Martha's own nephew, who managed records and discipline with chilling efficiency; and Daniel Yoda, the spiritual counselor, a man whose soft voice and empty eyes unnerved everyone he met. He could sense a doubt before it was spoken, and once he did, you would find yourself summoned privately, quietly, and you would not speak the same afterward. By the spring thaw of 1848, the camp's atmosphere had shifted entirely. Worship songs still rang through the hills. Chores were still done, but the joy had been drained from the place. Fear had taken its seat at the altar. What had begun as a revival had become a ritual, a system, a machine. And then Catherine Mueller arrived. Educated, strong-willed, too smart for her own safety, and everything began to unravel. When Catherine Mueller stepped into the new Light Camp in April of 1848, she was wrapped in a heavy shawl and an even heavier silence. She told the guards at the gate she was fleeing an abusive husband in Pittsburgh. Her hands trembled as she held a folded letter signed by Brother Marai himself, inviting her to seek refuge in the hills. At first, no one paid her much attention. New arrivals weren't uncommon. Women with nowhere else to turn came through those gates seeking peace, purpose, and sometimes just a warm bed. But Catherine wasn't like the others. She was sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, and unmistakably educated. She asked too many questions, remembered too many details. Not the typical pilgrim of broken faith, but what truly set her apart was how quickly Brother Marai became fascinated with her. Within days, she was seen entering his quarters for private consultations, long ones. Hours passed behind that carved wooden door. When she re-emerged, she looked paler each time, like the air in that room had drained some part of her. But she never spoke about what happened inside. The community took notice. Women whispered. Some were jealous. Others were afraid. The last time a woman had spent that much time with Marai, she had vanished 3 nights later, but Catherine wasn't. Like the others, she began to keep a journal. She asked to help clean the record room. She volunteered to teach children scripture, a job that gave her access to the camp's spiritual writings and Brother Marai's doctrine. What no one knew not, even Martha Brennan, was that Catherine was not who she claimed to be. Her name wasn't Mueller. It was Catherine Morrison, and she was part of a covert task force within the U.S. Treasury Department, investigating religious cults suspected of trafficking. She had spent 2 years trailing rumors from eastern Ohio to West Virginia before finally tracing the pattern to the new Light Camp Dot, and now she was inside Dot at first. Catherine played the part of the penitent believer. She sang hymns, baked bread, even confessed sins she hadn't committed. But every night, alone in her cabin, she wrote, not just in her journal, but in code notes she hoped to smuggle out if she ever got the chance. It was during these nights that the visions began. They weren't dreams, not exactly. They came like sudden flashes, almost like seizures, terrifying images of firelit chambers, screaming women, and strange diagrams scrawled on stone walls. She saw maps, symbols, phrases, in languages she didn't know she understood. And always at the center of it all was Brother Marai's face, kind, calm, and monstrously patient. At first, she dismissed the visions as stress, symptoms of her deep cover assignment. But then something strange happened. One night she woke up with blood on her hands and a word carved into her arm with a piece of charcoal. Reveal. That was when she knew something inside this camp was reaching back at her. The next morning, she approached the one person who still seemed capable of doubt. Martha Brennan. At first, Martha was hesitant. She'd seen too many women disappear, too many questions punished. But when Catherine spoke the names Rebecca Stoltzfus, Mary O'Sullivan, the Kaufman sisters, Martha's resolve cracked. Together, they made a plan. They would search Brother Marai's quarters. Catherine insisted that her visions had shown her where to look. Martha thought she was insane. But something about her certainty, her desperation, it reminded her of the women she had watched vanish. And so, on the night of June 3rd, under cover of the moonless sky, they crept across the camp. Marai's retreat was part cabin, part cave. It had only one door, sunk into the hillside, surrounded by trees that leaned inward as if trying to block the view. Silence hung around it, like fog. Catherine had brought a small lantern, wrapped in cloth, to dim the light. Martha carried a set of master keys, stolen from her nephew Samuel Keys, that unlocked every door in the camp. The first room looked harmless. A simple study, bookshelves filled with scripture, a writing desk, a bed so narrow it seemed to repel comfort. But Catherine walked straight to the wall, brushing her hands along the stone until she found the hidden latch. With a soft click, section of the wall opened. And the smell hit them like a wave. Damp soil, old blood, something rotten. What lay beyond wasn't just a secret chamber. It was a shrine, a tomb, a workshop of spiritual horror. Drawings covered the walls, sketches of faces, ritual diagrams, anatomical illustrations. A leather-bound journal sat on a pedestal, its pages written in Brother Marai's precise script. Each entry detailed the preparation of a woman, isolation, deprivation, special diets, obedience rituals. The words were cold, clinical, and terrifyingly methodical. Further in, they found a display of personal items, rings, hair clips, brooches, prayer books. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. These weren't just trophies. They were memorials. They were never translated, she whispered. They were harvested. In a small chest beneath the desk, they found a second journal correspondence between Marai and individuals identified only by initials. The letters mentioned shipments, deliveries, and quality evaluations. One letter talked about expanding the operation to Charleston and Philadelphia. One passage read, "The next 12 are nearly ready. The Pittsburgh girl is a high-value target. Begin processing immediately after solstice." Catherine stared at the page. She was the Pittsburgh girl. In a locked drawer. They found a map not of just Pennsylvania, but of 3 states, dozens of dots marked hidden religious camps, each annotated with names, numbers, and check marks beside women's names. It wasn't just the new Light Camp. It was a network, a hidden superstructure of human trafficking. Cloaked in robes and hymns. As they turned to leave, Catherine grabbed what she could: pages, maps, trinkets. Martha hesitated. If he knows we've been here, he already does, Catherine said. A noise: footsteps. They extinguished the lantern and ran back through the camp. Ducking behind cabins and outbuildings, they returned to Catherine's quarters just as the sky began to lighten. Hearts racing, minds shattered. By sunrise, everything changed. During breakfast, Brother Marai stood before the community with a tranquil smile and spoke. Sister Catherine has received a divine vision. Her elevation must proceed tonight, without delay. Martha dropped her cup. She tried to find Catherine, but her cabin was empty. Her things were gone. The bed was stripped. Other women had already accepted the news. Sister Catherine was taken early, someone said, called by God. But Martha knew better. She'd seen the list. Catherine was never meant to leave the camp alive. The next morning, the camp hummed with the familiar lie. Catherine had been chosen. She had been taken. She had been blessed. Brother Marai's voice carried through the morning mist like a hymn. She received a vision in the night, one so powerful it could not wait. Her ascension was immediate, pure, complete, divine. And the camp believed him. They always did. It didn't matter that Catherine's belongings were gone, or that no one had seen her since the evening before, or that she hadn't even said goodbye. These things were not evidence of deception, but of righteousness. They were told she was too holy to linger, that earthly farewells would only hinder her spiritual work. But for Martha Brennan, it wasn't just another disappearance. This time, she'd seen what they were supposed to forget. This time, the lie had a ledger, a map, a journal, and most damning of all, a list with her own name on it. Catherine's loss hit Martha harder than she expected. She hadn't known her long, but something about Catherine had cracked the hard shell Martha had formed over years of quiet suspicion. She was like the daughters Martha had once raised, sharp, determined, brave to a fault. And now she was gone, disappeared beneath the same sweet smiling lie that had devoured so many before her. But Martha didn't have the luxury of grief. She had seen the schedule. The final harvest was coming. 12 women marked for translation. Catherine's name had been first. Hers had been second, and the clock was ticking. The days that followed passed in a haze of paranoia. Martha felt the eyes on her more than usual. The assistants, especially her nephew Samuel Brennan, were never far. He used to greet her with warmth, but now his smile was practiced, empty. He asked how she was sleeping. He suggested she seek spiritual counseling. He offered to bring her tea, laced with calming herbs. Martha recognized the tactic. This was containment. She was being watched. She had always known Brother Marai's power wasn't just in his sermons. It was in his control of information. Now she understood just how deep that control ran. The doctrine that kept the camp obedient was the doctrine of sacred silence, an unwritten law that forbade anyone from speaking about the translated women. Not out of shame, but because they were told it was dangerous to do so. Talking about them, Marai taught, could pull them back, disrupt their spiritual missions, and jeopardize their eternal work. To mourn was selfish. To question was blasphemy. To remember was a sin. That silence did more than keep secrets. It transformed the entire camp into a machine of suppression. Even thoughts had to be managed. People learned to censor themselves, to smile even when afraid, to repeat Marai's words even when their hearts ached with unspoken grief. And anyone who couldn't, they vanished, just like Catherine, just like Rebecca, just like Sarah. The camp was a closed circuit, its outer walls keeping the world out and the truth in. The women didn't just disappear physically. They were erased from history. No tombstones, no records, not even whispered stories around the fire. Just empty cabins and repurposed clothes, Behind this system of control were the vessels of Light Marai's 3 assistants, each serving a different function in his machine. Jeremiah Whitmore was the public face. He corresponded with families, merchants, and outside pastors. He had a warm handshake and a voice like a radio preacher. His letters were elegant forgeries of reassurance, telling mothers and sisters that their loved ones had been called to serve God in distant lands. Samuel Brennan, Martha's nephew, was the record keeper. His journals tracked every family, every quarrel, every spiritual confession. He knew who was loyal, who was weak, who was ready to be prepared. His notes, Martha suspected, informed Marai's choices. Then there was Daniel Yoda. The spiritual counselor. Yoda didn't smile. He didn't raise his voice. But he had a talent, a monstrous one. He could sniff out doubt like a bloodhound. People feared being called into private sessions with him. Some came out visibly shaken. Others emerged strangely compliant. A few never returned at all. Martha had spent years believing Daniel Yoda was simply intense. Now she knew better. By midsummer, the camp's demographics had begun to shift dramatically. Of the 43 original families, only 31 remained. Entire cabins had been reassigned. New faces began appearing, young women, alone, supposedly sent by the Lord from nearby congregations. But Martha noticed the pattern. The women were always pretty, always emotionally frayed, and always quick to surrender to the camp's doctrine. They weren't recruits. They were replacements. And Brother Marai had a new doctrine to support their arrival: spiritual marriages. Declared that earthly marriages had no bearing in the divine order. If a man's wife had been translated, he could take another, chosen by God, without sin. These unions were holy, he said, even if they lacked the paperwork of earthly law. It was a clever tactic. It gave single men purpose, reassured widowers, and provided a mechanism to cycle new women into the camp. The promise was always the same. True believers would eventually be elevated, too, and they were, just not in the way anyone expected. Martha's doubts, once buried beneath years of routine and ritual, had now burst into flame. But doubt alone wouldn't save her. She needed evidence, proof, and a plan. The problem? She was alone. Catherine had been the only one brave enough to act. Everyone else was either too afraid, too indoctrinated, or too embedded in the system to help. Even those who suspected the truth were trapped by the doctrine of sacred silence, and the assistants were growing suspicious. One morning, while sweeping the walkway near the central hall, Martha found a scrap of parchment torn from one of Catherine's journals. It had only 3 words: loose floorboard, letters. It was all she needed. 3 days later, Brother Marai announced a camp-wide fast 3 days of isolation, silence, and meditation to prepare for a great spiritual work. Meals were suspended. Movement was limited. The assistants patrolled on a rotating schedule. But for Martha, the fast was an opportunity. The restrictions masked her odd behavior. If she wandered at night, she could claim she was seeking prayer. If she looked pale and nervous, that was fasting's effect. She was invisible under the guise of devotion. On the second night, when the camp was still, she slipped into the woods, made her way to Marai's quarters, and opened the hidden door. Inside, the room had changed. New items had been added to the shrine, including Catherine's brooch. Worse, new entries in Marai's journal described Martha herself, her personality, her habits, her resistance. She had been studied, catalogued. Prepared. But beneath the loose floorboard, just as Catherine had said, she found them. A bundle of letters, tied in red string, marked with the initials JRTHE. Y referenced shipments, routes, and payments. Names of judges, sheriffs, priests. One letter, dated just 2 weeks earlier, read, The Brennan problem must be resolved before summer solstice. The Mueller asset is compromised. Retire both. Martha's blood froze. Catherine hadn't been. A victim by chance, she had been sent in. A spy, an agent. Her visions had been real and guided, and now she was gone. Martha didn't know what scared her more, the truth of what Catherine had been, or the fact that it hadn't saved her. Martha clutched the letters, her hands trembling. The words scrawled in elegant penmanship weren't just instructions. They were blueprints for a machine of evil, one that had operated in plain sight under the guise of salvation. They mentioned more than just Clearfield, dozens of towns, rural outposts, revival camps, each marked as a collection point, each tied into a spiderweb of coordinated trafficking routes. The language was clinical terms like yield, processing efficiency, spiritual readiness, but what they described was unmistakable. The new Light Methodist Camp wasn't unique. It was one node in a network, operating across 3 states and countless churches, hidden behind pulpit and prayer. And someone named J.R., writing from Philadelphia, was pulling the strings. Martha's head swam. The final letter confirmed her. Worst fear. The Brennan woman has been identified as a risk. Process her with the next cycle. Maintain her dignity. We cannot afford another Mueller debacle. The cold politeness of it made her nauseous. Maintain her dignity. As if killing her with ritual made it less of a murder, she tucked the letters into the folds of her cloak, careful to avoid rustling. She still had to get out alive, but just as she turned to leave the chamber, a noise froze her in place. Footsteps. The slow pacing of Marai's midnight rituals. These were quick, deliberate, moving toward the main entrance. Her candle flickered in panic. She blew it out. The chamber fell into darkness. Then came the sound of keys. The front door opened. A murmur of voices, low and masculine. One of them was Brother Marai. "Sister Martha," he said softly, "I know. You're in there." She didn't breathe. His voice echoed down the stone hallway, calm, patient, confident. "There's no need for fear. You've merely misunderstood what you found. Come, let's talk." Martha pressed herself into the wall, clutching the letters like a shield. The stone was cold, damp against her back. She could hear his robes rustle as he settled into a chair. He wasn't trying to flush her out. Not yet. He was performing. He believed she had nowhere to go. "You've always been a devoted soul," he continued, tone gentle. "But devotion without understanding can lead to confusion. That's what happened to Sister Catherine. She was misguided." He said her name without emotion, as if Catherine were just a footnote in his theology. "You're not like her." He said, "You still have a place in this work." The air felt thick. The chamber seemed to shrink. That's when Martha knew he wasn't bluffing. He truly believed what he was saying. Brother Marai began pacing. His voice changed, slipping into that hypnotic rhythm he used during sermons. "You think what you found down here is wicked, but the Christian church has been weak for too long, watered down by softness, compromised by sentiment." He paused. "What we do here restores order. Not just spiritual order, natural order. Some are meant to serve, others to lead. The world forgot this truth. We are its restoration." Martha's heart pounded in her throat. He wasn't a fraud. He was a fanatic, a true believer in a twisted, divine hierarchy where women were commodities, elevation was enslavement, and spiritual language was just camouflage for brutality. Then came the final blow. "I've spoken to Samuel," he said. "Your nephew is deeply concerned for your well-being. He thinks you're unwell. He believes you may need guidance. The kind Daniel Yoda provides." Martha's stomach turned. She had harbored a sliver of hope that Samuel was still the boy she raised after his mother died, that he wasn't fully part of this, but that hope shattered now. Samuel wasn't lost. He was loyal. And she was next. That was when Martha made her decision. No more hiding. No more hoping someone else would act. She dropped to her knees, groping for the escape hatch. Catherine had once shown her the narrow, rusted window set low in the stone. She hadn't dared use it before, not with Marai's voice luring her toward the door like a spider calling from its web. But now there was no choice. She shoved the window open, ignoring the squeal of rusted hinges, and hurled herself through. The glass shattered. Sharp edges sliced her arms and face. The fall twisted her ankle violently. Pain erupted through her leg like fire, but she was outside. She didn't stop to think. She ran limping, bleeding, clutching the stolen letters. Behind her, the calm mask fell away. She's gone. Brother Marai roared. Find her. The forest was a blur of shadows and branches. The camp behind her lit up like a wasp's nest. Shouts, lanterns, horses being saddled. She heard Daniel Yoda's deep voice calling orders. Heard Samuel's frantic footsteps chasing her trail. She crashed through underbrush, pain blinding her, heart pounding like a drumbeat of war. Each sound behind her felt too close. Each twig snapped beneath her own feet sounded like a gunshot. She thought she heard dogs, and then faint. In the distance, the barking of real one's dogs, not from the camp, from a settlement. She turned toward the sound. The last mile was a nightmare. Her twisted ankle gave out more than once. She crawled. For part of it, her dress was torn, her hands bloodied. The letters inside her coat were soaked through with sweat and blood, but the promise of human contact pulled her forward. She pictured a sheriff's badge, a town square, an oil lamp in a window. Anything but the lies she'd left behind. As the sky began to pale, she saw it the faint outline of a fence, a chimney, a dirt road. She collapsed into the town of Clearfield. Just as the sun breached the hills. Sheriff Thomas Mackenzie had never seen anything like her. A blood-soaked woman limping into town at dawn, clutching a bundle of papers like they were the only thing tethering her to sanity. At first, he dismissed her story as trauma-fueled hysteria. But then she said his name, said it was in the documents. He took the pages with a skeptical frown. Read a few lines. His brow furrowed. Then he flipped through more and more, and then his face changed. Panic. Because one of the letters described him not by name, but by title. Local sheriff in Clearfield, sympathetic if financially persuaded. The implications struck like a hammer. They had tabs on him. Someone in Philadelphia knew who he was, what he could be paid, what he could be threatened with. Suddenly, Martha Brennan wasn't crazy. She was a survivor. 2 days later, when Mackenzie led a small group of men up to the camp, they found nothing. The buildings were there, but gutted. Records gone, ashes cold. Footprints erased. Every trace of the operation systematically wiped clean. The camp had been abandoned, like a military post before a siege. Brother Marai, his vessels of light, and the remaining women had vanished. But what they left behind was far more dangerous than a body. Martha still had the letters, and she still had her voice. But even she couldn't foresee what came next. Because as she lay in a Clearfield barn that night, leg wrapped, wounds stitched, voice hoarse from recounting horrors to anyone who would listen, a man in a dark overcoat knocked on the sheriff's door. He didn't show a badge, but he knew Catherine's real name. The man who arrived in Clearfield just after sundown wore a federal coat but carried no badge. His face was weathered, his speech clipped and precise. Sheriff Mackenzie had barely finished cleaning his revolver when the knock came. "You're hosting someone I need to speak with," the stranger said plainly. "And you are?" Mackenzie asked, gripping the edge of his desk. The man handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter stamped by the Treasury Department, but coded in language unfamiliar to the sheriff. At the bottom was a line that froze Mackenzie in place. Field Agent Catherine Morrison embedded operative, presumed missing. Confirmed contact. Martha Brennan. Catherine Morrison, not Mueller, not a victim, a federal agent. That night, the stranger met with Martha in a dimly lit barn office Mackenzie had converted into a makeshift safe house. Her face was pale, eyes haunted, but her spine had not buckled. Man sat without speaking for a moment, just observing her, measuring. Then he leaned forward. "You were with her when she disappeared?" Martha nodded. "We searched his chambers together." She found the journals, the map, the names. And what happened? She vanished the next morning. Marai said she'd been called early. No preparation, no ceremony, just gone. The man gave a grim nod. She wasn't taken to be elevated. She was taken to be extracted. What Martha didn't know, and now learned in hushed words behind locked doors, was that Catherine Morrison had been part of a secret initiative within the federal government, an experimental task force investigating religious cults suspected of human trafficking and illegal export of persons. Catherine's mission had been dangerous from the start. The Treasury had received disturbing intelligence from intercepted letters and economic anomalies in several frontier towns places where young women seemed to vanish from the census at rates that defied natural explanation. They noticed that religious revival camps were flourishing, but the names of their attendees often dropped off the map entirely. The pattern spanned Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and beyond. The conclusion was unthinkable, and so Catherine had volunteered. Fluent speaker in several European languages, a trained field analyst, and most importantly, someone with a personal stake. Her own cousin had vanished from a revival camp in 1845. The plan was never for Catherine to stay long. She was to infiltrate, gather intelligence, identify leadership, and get out. But something had gone wrong. She had stayed too long, gotten too close. The mission had shifted. "She sent us a coded message," the agent told Martha. "Just one. No return location. Just the words. They are not dead. They are being sold." That message had triggered emergency protocols. A week later, she vanished. Catherine wasn't dead, the agent explained. At least, not officially. They had reason to believe she'd been transported to a central node of the trafficking network. Not killed, but processed. She was valuable, dangerous. If Marai's network suspected she was a spy, they wouldn't execute her immediately. They would study her, break her, reprogram her, or worse, use her as leverage. Martha sat quietly, the revelations crashing over her. Like waves. "If you knew where she was sent," she whispered, "why haven't you gone after her?" The agent hesitated. "We're dealing with something larger than you can imagine. This isn't just one camp or one cult leader. This is an infrastructure funded, protected, even covered up." "Covered up by who?" The man's voice dropped. "Judges, sheriffs, clergy, officials as high as state senators. Marai isn't the architect. He's just one builder." Martha stared at the floor. All this time, she'd thought she was fighting a monster. She'd been fighting a machine. In the following weeks, Martha remained under protection while a shadow war unfolded behind the scenes. Federal agents, unofficial and unseen, began raiding remote camps, arresting select individuals, gathering evidence in total secrecy. They didn't trust local lawmen. They didn't trust newspapers. They barely even trusted the government itself. Still, within 6 months, 12 camps across 3 states had been shut down. Nearly 400 women were confirmed missing. Some were never found. Others were discovered in distant cities, confused, malnourished, stripped of memory and identity, their stories dismissed as delusions. But the most important figure, the one they called Jair, was never captured. Files identifying the higher leadership of the network were sealed, reportedly under national security directives. Catherine's location was never confirmed. As for Brother Marai, gone, vanished like a ghost. Rumors placed him in California, others in South America, hiding among mining camps or frontier churches. Some believed he died in a fire that consumed a new light offshoot near the Mississippi River. Others said he was alive and well, teaching again under a new name. Martha never stopped looking over her shoulder. She tried, in the months that followed, to make the truth known. She sent letters to Philadelphia papers, wrote editorials under pseudonyms, even tried to publish a short booklet detailing what she'd seen. But her manuscripts were returned unread. One letter from a prominent Christian publisher replied, "We do not entertain hysterical claims that attack the sanctity of revival movements. Suggest you seek psychiatric care." The church denied her. The government ignored her. Even friends whispered that she had let grief make her bitter. Martha lived another 19 years, mostly in isolation, regarded by many as a sad relic of spiritual tragedy. She died in 1867 in a boarding house in Harrisburg. Among her belongings were copies of the original letters, journal entries, and a single photograph of a woman in a white dress. On the back, written in her hand, "Catherine Morrison, my sister in truth." But her legacy didn't die. In 2019, a demolition team clearing what was once the new Light campground in Clearfield uncovered buried stonework beneath the meeting hall. A hidden chamber, partially collapsed, lined with shelves and altar-like recesses. Inside were trinkets, hair, jewelry, journals, and a rusted lantern. Federal authorities sealed the site within 48 hours. To this day, no official report has been released. The excavation team disbanded. The site, bought by a private security contractor and made permanently inaccessible to the public. What remains is Martha's story, Catherine's mission, and the unsettling knowledge that not everything was buried. The network was never destroyed, only scattered. By the 1860s, similar camps appeared in Kansas and Nebraska, refined and made harder to trace. Their sermons were sweeter, their rules more moderate. But their purpose, historians suspect, remained the same. By the time federal agents had stopped tracking the last of the new Light affiliates, the trail had gone cold. And a new generation of recruiters had taken up the cause modern faces. With ancient intent, Catherine Morrison was never found, but survivors who later came forward described a woman in their facility calm, unreadable, with eyes that seemed to burn through walls. She refused to speak, but she had a habit of tracing. Letters with her finger in the dust. One of them watched her trace the same name again and again, Martha. The map Catherine and Martha had discovered, creased, yellowed, marked with strange codes, wasn't just a diagram. It was a confession in cartographic form. A web of dots and lines connecting rural communities, revival sites, and long-forgotten missions stretching across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, and reaching westward into territories yet settled. Each dot was annotated with a date, a number, a brief note: yield 6, harvested 9, asset lost 1. What stunned investigators wasn't just the scale, it was the precision. These were not the wild workings of a mad preacher. This was a system, methodical, efficient, protected, and replicated. In the years after Martha Brennan's escape and Catherine Morrison's infiltration, the federal task force quietly moved to suppress the entire truth. Too many powerful names had appeared in the correspondence she recovered: judges, clergy, even military chaplains. The exposure would have devastated faith in institutions already shaken by war and political upheaval. Instead, they opted for containment. Raids were conducted under different pretexts. Investigators were sworn to silence. Files were relabeled under innocuous bureaucratic codes. The term New Light disappeared from official reports, replaced with phrases like unregulated, religious migration, or frontier evangelism anomalies. The story was too dangerous to tell, but the pattern it couldn't be hidden. By 1852, government analysts noticed similar spikes in disappearances tied to second-generation camps springing up in Missouri, Illinois, and Kansas Territory. These camps were cleaner, better organized, and more legally insulated. They registered as charities. They issued printed bulletins. Some even filed tax records, but the symptoms were the same. Young women, drawn in by promises of spiritual rebirth, vanished after rituals cloaked in doctrine. Locals were told they had been called to missions. Churches sent vague notices to families, congratulating them on their daughter's elevation. And the families, already overwhelmed by poverty, distance, and silence, believed. Because who would lie in God's name? One such camp, later known to federal agents as Eagle Hollow, was established near the Missouri River in early 1851. It bore uncanny similarities to the New Light model. Isolated valley, communal living, male-dominated leadership, and a central figure who claimed to receive divine visions during periods of fasting and silence. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then census records revealed that between 1851 and 1854, 19 unmarried women disappeared from the area with no explanation. The authorities arrived too late. The site was abandoned, its church stripped bare. Ashes filled the baptismal font. In the hollow beneath the pulpit, agents found a stone basin and 3 carved names: Rachel, Naomi, Delilah. Nothing else. No journals, no letters, just absence etched into the structure of faith. Back in Pennsylvania, Sheriff Mackenzie resigned within a year of the Clearfield incident. His efforts to report what he had seen were met with bureaucratic indifference and subtle threats. Transfer was offered, then a demotion. Then silence. He left public life and retreated to a farmhouse on the outskirts of Williamsport, where he died in 1871. In his attic, a box was found containing copies of the letters Martha had recovered, alongside a detailed diary. In one entry, dated March 1850, he wrote, "If what I saw in Clearfield is true, and I believe it is, then no pulpit in this country is safe from corruption. The devil wears robes. He carries scripture in one hand and ledgers in the other." His writings were quietly confiscated by state officials. The box, like so much else, disappeared into the void of unfiled evidence, but Martha's influence lingered. In other places, a teacher in Lancaster County named Eleanor Griggs, who once heard Martha speak at a women's charity meeting, began tracking unusual patterns in parish records, particularly in German and Dutch congregations. She noted how certain families suddenly lost daughters to missions out west, yet never received letters or confirmation of arrival. In 1857, she tried to publish her findings in a pamphlet titled The Doctrine of Disappearance, an inquiry into female exodus from Protestant communities. Only 50 copies were printed before the press was destroyed in a mysterious fire. Eleanor herself was later institutionalized. Her publisher vanished from business. Records within a year. In these early decades of cover-up, the network adapted. Gone were the isolated camps hidden deep in forest valleys. Now they operated through orphanages, church schools, even medical charities. They dressed their systems in compassion, wrapped their rituals in psychology. The doctrine of translation was updated. REBRAND. Now it was resettlement, or emotional purification, or divine redirection. Women were still vanishing, but this time no one questioned it, because the paperwork looked clean and the sermons sounded kind, but the methods Beneath the surface hadn't changed. Agents who managed to infiltrate the newer organizations under different aliases and across multiple states reported similar patterns: indoctrination through isolation and obedience, preparation stages involving modified diets, ritual sleep deprivation, and intense prayer sessions, the use of scripture twisted to demand surrender of identity, and always, at the end, a night of transcendence, followed by nothing. 1. Field agent working in Iowa in 1860 described a white march ritual in which 6 women walked single file into a building and were never seen again. The local reverend claimed they had been sent to New York. Their names never appeared on any boat registry, train log, or census again. Historians in the 20th century, when eventually permitted to review fragments of redacted files, found no consistent central figure beyond the original trail that began with Brother Marai, the elusive J.R., whose correspondence hinted at high-level control, remained a cipher. Some believed he was a church official with political ambitions. Others thought he was a pseudonym for a coalition of backers, masking funding routes and order chains. Whatever the case, his letters vanished after 1855. Almost as if the project had gone so far underground. Not even its originators wanted to be associated with it. But whispers persisted. A missionary in New Orleans reported seeing women in high society gatherings, whose manners were immaculate, but whose eyes were empty. He said they behaved like trained dancers, spoke rarely, and seemed to follow invisible cues from their male companions. In a letter never meant for publication, he wrote, "They moved like angels. They looked like saints. But every one of them had the silence of a grave in her throat." By the time the Civil War erupted, the network had buried its roots too deep to pull out. Investigators were reassigned to military intelligence. Attention shifted to battlefields and borders. The camps were gone, but the methods remained, passed from one generation of manipulators to the next. Each time with new names, new scripture, disguises. But always the same core belief, that obedience was holiness, and that surrender made the perfect offering. Martha's warnings, scrawled in fading ink and dismissed by editors and elders alike, now serve as one of the only first-hand accounts that tie the original Clearfield operation to the broader network that followed. In one of her last letters, dated just a year before her death, she wrote, "I know what I saw. They will silence me, but they cannot silence the truth itself. It waits beneath floorboards, behind scripture, inside empty cabins. It waits for someone to ask again, where did all the women go?" And it's a question we're still asking. By the dawn of the 1870s, the original New Light movement had become a ghost story, a thing whispered about in cautious corners of theological schools and among retired circuit preachers who'd spent time in the Appalachian backwoods. But the story, like so many truths buried beneath polite society, never really died. It metastasized. The movement had shed its skin. Gone were the frontier camps surrounded by walls, and scripture-slicked sermons echoing through pine forests. In their place were institutions with respectability sewn into their very names: home for troubled women, Sisterhood of Mercy, New Hope Restoration Center, and perhaps most chillingly, the Evangelical Society for the Spiritual Reform of Wayward Souls. On the surface, these organizations seemed benevolent. They took in runaways, the impoverished, the broken, the women no one else had time for. They offered food, shelter, and healing, physical and spiritual. But underneath, the old doctrine lived on. Surrender, obedience, transformation. The language had changed. The rituals had evolved. But the goal remained the same: to erase the self and make the subject useful for a purpose she would never understand. Some of these modern institutions even claim to draw on the legacy of Martha Brennan, reframing her as an early advocate. for women's spiritual sanctity and moral purity distorting her name into a posthumous mascot for the very systems she tried to destroy. In one pamphlet from 1878 titled The Brennan Method, A Moral Path for the Reclamation of Fallen Women, the author referred to Martha not as a whistleblower or survivor, but as a soul lost then found, whose journey of doubt led her back to obedience. The text claimed she had recanted her wild accusations before her death and died at peace with her role in the divine chain of service. There is no historical evidence of such a recantation. In fact, her final letters reflect increasing desperation to be believed. But once history is owned by the victors, truth becomes malleable. As the decades rolled forward, the old structure of the new light camps, built on fear, faith, and isolation, was broken down into smaller, harder to detect pieces. Instead of one centralized leader like Brother Marai, there were now committees, boards, mission advisors. Instead of fire-lit sermons, there were instructional lectures delivered to young women seated at long wooden tables, hands folded, eyes forward. Instead of translation, the term was now placement. You have been chosen, the instructors would say, to begin again, to leave the self behind, to serve something greater than your own desires. The women who resisted were labeled spiritually obstructed. They were given days of silence, days of fasting, emotional reorientation. Then they disappeared. Their files were marked, relocated. No follow-up required. In 1882, a schoolteacher from Canton, Ohio, named Beatrice Winslow, began to notice unusual discrepancies in the admissions records of her boarding school. Girls who had been enrolled suddenly disappeared mid-term. Their tuition was refunded from unnamed sponsors. Parents, when contacted, claimed their daughters had received callings. Beatrice had heard rumors of girls sent away to spiritual reform houses who were never seen again, of revivals in the foothills where no one came back, of hymns sung in languages no one could translate. She began to investigate. And within a year, she too vanished. Her notes, discovered decades later in a church basement, were filled with questions. None answered. Why are these placements one way? Where do they go after the final evaluation? Why is the same group of men present at every transfer? In the margin of one page, she scrawled a phrase that had not appeared in any known publication before or since: doctrine of ascending utility. By the time the 20th century arrived, the old horror had taken on a new vocabulary. Psychological studies replaced scripture. Behavioral reconditioning replaced prayer. And theology was distilled into abstract justification. The greater good, societal purification, mental clarity through obedience. One such facility, operating in upstate New York, under the name the House of Still Waters, used methods strikingly similar to those practiced by Brother Marai. Women were assigned mentors, given new names, told they were being reborn, forbidden to speak of their pasts. When investigators later uncovered the facility's ledger during a tax fraud probe in 1947, the back pages listed 47 women under the title Final Phase Complete. No forwarding address, no graves, no public records. Just check marks. And silence. A psychiatrist working for the state of Pennsylvania during that time, Dr. Harold Fleiss, encountered one of these women accidentally. She had been admitted to a county hospital under the name Sister Elaine, found wandering along a railroad track with bloodied feet and an emaciated frame. She spoke in odd, rhythmic phrases and refused to give her real name. But in her sleep, she muttered names: Catherine, Rebecca, Sarah. And once, just once, she whispered, light must be harvested before it turns. Dr. Fleiss interviewed her 17 times. In his final report, he wrote, she is not delusional. She is programmed. Whatever she escaped, it is not over. We are studying a symptom, not a cause. By the 1970s, official documentation of the New Light movement had been reduced to a handful of sealed files labeled cultural fragmentation events. Academics who tried to publish on the topic were routinely discredited or defunded, but some, like Professor Lydia Rowe of Stanford, persisted. Her 1976 dissertation titled Harvest Doctrine, The Theological Disappearance of Female Agency in American Sectarian History, argued that the New Light teachings laid the groundwork for a centuries-long institutional pattern of gendered erasure. Disguised as spiritual elevation. She cited Brennan, Morrison, Winslow, Fleiss, and she claimed, boldly, that the doctrine still existed, not in its old language, but in its bones. Passed down like liturgy, hidden in curricula, repackaged for every new cultural wave. Her dissertation was buried by faculty. She was denied her doctorate. She published the paper herself in 1981. In a niche underground theological journal. It circulated among academics for a few years, then vanished. Some claim Rowe went into seclusion. Others say she was recruited. What remained was the doctrine. It adapted. It waited. It moved with the culture. Today, we no longer speak of camps or elevation or translations, but still women disappear. They are rescued into private reform programs. Enter restorative spiritual centers. Sign up for discipline-based faith journeys, and they do not come back. Their names vanish from databases. Their photos fade from school. Yearbooks. Their families are given just enough of a story to stop asking. And the network continues. Now more sophisticated, more respectable, more invisible. But occasionally a voice slips through. A page is torn loose. A name resurfaces. And when it does, it often comes with an old phrase scratched in the corner of the margin. Sacred silence preserves the flame. It's how the doctrine keeps surviving. And it's how we know it never really died. In 1991, a reporter named Elaine Wexler was assigned what she thought would be a standard human interest piece for the Pittsburgh Ledger. A nostalgic profile of a century-old Methodist revival camp in the Allegheny backcountry being revived for modern faith seekers. The site had been recently acquired by a nonprofit religious group called the New Light Fellowship, a name no one found alarming except Elaine. She'd heard that phrase before, 20 years earlier, as a graduate assistant at the University of Chicago. She had come across a bootlegged copy of Lydia Rowe's banned dissertation. The phrases had stuck with her. Translated, harvest, surrender through obedience. And now that language was back-polished and repackaged for a new century. What Elaine thought would be a simple feature article turned into an investigation that would consume her for the next 6 years. The New Light Fellowship, according to their website, was a revivalist movement grounded in the discipline of spiritual unity, the healing of disordered identity, and the purification of feminine calling. Their campus, nestled on repurposed land in Clearfield County, had formerly been an abandoned timber operation. No one publicly acknowledged that it lay directly atop the ruins of the original New Light Methodist Camp. There were no historical markers, no plaques. Just a parking lot, a welcome center, and a chapel. From the outside, it looked peaceful, but Elaine noticed the language was too careful. Their literature referred to women not as members, but as vessels. Their entry programs were called refinements. Their exit protocols were described as upward transitions. It was too familiar. Elaine attended one of their public orientation weekends under an alias, posing as a writer for a Christian parenting magazine. The retreat was orderly, joyful, almost boring. Women wore white cotton dresses. Smiles were constant. Sermons focused on obedience and unity. But when Elaine asked about prior members, names of past participants, or even basic logistics, the answers vanished into vagueness. No photos during services. No comment on participant numbers. Personal. Records are confidential out of respect. She watched one young woman, barely 20, sit through an hour-long lecture with a fixed, distant smile. Later that night, Elaine overheard her repeating the phrase, "Release brings radiance," over and over in the prayer garden. She was gone by morning. The group told Elaine she had completed her journey. After returning to Pittsburgh, Elaine filed for incorporation records, IRS tax disclosures, and historical land ownership documents tied to the fellowship. What she found chilled her. The group was listed under a parent corporation based in Philadelphia, a financial trust managed by a single anonymous board member, signed only as Jr. The same initials Martha Brennan had found beneath the floorboards in 1849, and they were still active. Elaine took her findings to a local historian, Dr. Hugh Ramsey, a man whose career had been built on cataloging forgotten religious movements in Appalachia. When she showed him the phrase, "Sacred silence preserves the flame," carved above the chapel's altar, his hands visibly shook. He disappeared from public lectures a month later. A colleague later claimed Dr. Ramsey had been pressured into early retirement after an unnamed donor withdrew funding from the university's religious studies department. Elaine was warned twice. First, by phone, a flat voice advising her to let sleeping sanctuaries lie. Then by mail, an envelope containing nothing but a copy of Harvest Doctrine, marked with a red X through Catherine Morrison's name. Elaine did not stop. She returned to Clearfield County in early spring of 1993, this time accompanied by a former law enforcement officer turned private investigator named Paul Hamner, who had once worked on a missing persons task force in West Virginia. Hamner had seen too many girls disappear from faith-based shelters over the years, and he'd seen what happened when local sheriffs asked too many questions. Budgets cut, reassignments, transfers. He believed Elaine. What they discovered next shifted their investigation from disturbing to horrifying. In a disused storeroom beneath the retreat's kitchen, Elaine spotted something odd brickwork that didn't match the rest of the foundation. With the help of a sympathetic maintenance worker, she accessed the space late at night. Behind that wall was a sealed basement room, lined with smooth stone, covered in chalked phrases. At the center was a raised platform, scorched at the corners. Carved into the wall above it, weathered and shallow, were three names: Rebecca, Mary, Catherine. This wasn't just a revival. It was a resurrection. Elaine and died. Hamner documented everything: photos, voice recordings, sketches, and left before sunrise. They submitted their findings to a former federal agent Hamner still had contact with, a man who had once worked on trafficking investigations and investigations in the Osage 1970s. The response was chillingly brief: burn the files. You're in over your head. They're not gone. They're just quiet, and they have friends. Hamner's contact went missing 2 weeks later. The tapes they submitted vanished from evidence storage. Elaine was doxxed by a fringe religious group and harassed into moving out of her apartment. By 1996, Elaine Wexler had become a pariah in journalism. Her editor dismissed her findings as conspiratorial zealotry. Her credentials were quietly stripped by several press associations. And then, like so many before her, she vanished. Last seen driving toward northern Pennsylvania with a notebook full of names and dates. Her car was found 6 days later. Keys still in the ignition, at a trailhead near the old coal roads outside Clearfield. In the trunk, authorities found a copy of Lydia Rowe's dissertation and a photograph of a woman in white. Some say Elaine went underground, determined to finish Catherine Morrison's work. Others say she was taken elevated by the new generation of harvesters who now worked in clinical robes instead of preachers' coats. A letter arrived at her mother's home 1 year later. It was postmarked from Charleston, South Carolina. Inside was a single page. She has found the light. Do not search for her. Her journey is sacred. It was unsigned, but the letterhead read, "The Doctrine of Sacred Renewal. The land where the camp stood is now owned by a faith-based real estate foundation. No further investigations have been permitted. The chapel was torn down in 2002. The stones were burned. The ground was reseeded with wild grass. But locals say, on certain nights, when the moon is high and fog presses low into the fields, if you walk the perimeter of the old foundations, you'll still hear it, a woman's voice repeating the same name over and over. Catherine." In the winter of 2008, a graduate student at Columbia University named Renee Thatcher began her doctoral thesis on the evolution of 19th century religious language in American evangelical movements. It was supposed to be a dry academic pursuit, but her research led her to something unexpected, a near-forgotten collection of unpublished field notes by Lydia Rowe, stored in the university's restricted archives. Renee didn't know the name at first. Rowe was just a footnote, a scholar marked controversial and unverified in theological studies indexes. But the further Renee read, the deeper the rabbit hole went. Rowe hadn't been a crank. She'd been a historian who got too close to a truth someone wanted forgotten. That one folder in particular bore no official title, just a phrase stamped in faded ink: "The doctrine endures." Inside were transcribed testimonies, half-burned correspondence, location coordinates, and one disturbing artifact, a handwritten diary page that ended mid-sentence. "They don't take your name right away. First, they take your appetite, then your will, then your voice. Only when you've forgotten who you were do they say, 'Now, you're ready.'" Beneath the page was a sketch of a multi-room facility with security gates and color-coded dormitories. It looked nothing like a revival camp. It looked like a modern treatment center. Renee cross-referenced the coordinates with GIS mapping software and found that the site now housed a behavioral rehabilitation complex called Everlite Institute, located just outside Asheville, North Carolina. The facility advertised itself as a retreat for the spiritual and emotionally burdened, catering primarily to young women who had experienced moral deviation or crisis of purpose. But their website raised red flags immediately. All testimonials were anonymous. No photos showed participants, and its mission statement used eerily familiar phrases: "We harvest the divine spark. Obedience purifies identity. The vessel becomes radiant through silence." Renee froze. She remembered Rowe's phrase, "Sacred silence preserves the flame." Driven by academic obsession, or perhaps something deeper, Renee reached out to the Institute, posing as a concerned older sister seeking treatment for her sibling. She inquired about the process, the timeline, the visitation policy. The woman who responded, calling herself Sister Mara, spoke in soothing tones. "Yes, of course. We help her begin again. One must forget to remember." Renee asked what that meant. There was a pause. Then Mara repeated the phrase in a different tone, slower, emphatic, as if it were a coded response. "One must forget to remember." That night, Renee submitted a request to interview former participants. She reached out to local news outlets, mental health organizations, even trauma recovery centers in nearby towns. Most had never heard of Everlite. A few mentioned girls sent there by churches, but gave no further comment. 2 weeks later, Renee's university email was locked due to suspicious activity. Her thesis advisor distanced himself. Her access to Rowe's papers was revoked. Same week, her apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen, except her research notes. Renee went underground. She published an anonymous article online under the pseudonym Final Vessel, detailing her findings. It was posted to a fringe theology forum, where it received only a few dozen views, but one comment stood out. A user named Light Reclaimed replied, "I was there. I saw the white room. I watched the lights go out behind her eyes. I made it out. You're not crazy. They're not done." Renee messaged the user immediately. What came next would change everything. The woman behind the username was Megan Ruiz, now 37, and living in hiding in the Midwest. In a series of encrypted video calls, she revealed that in 1996, at the age of 15, she had been sent to a reform program by a local church in Kansas. She arrived at what she thought was a retreat. She didn't come out for 11 months. And when she did, she was no longer herself. She described days of fasting paired with hypnotic sermons, a strict schedule where speech was rationed, speech tokens, they called it, daily reflections, where women were punished for remembering personal details, a white room where, once inside, no one came back the same. There were no locks, Megan said, but we never left. We forgot how. When asked how she escaped, Megan paused. There was a woman. She came in pretending to be one of them. She whispered to me at night. Said she was looking for someone named Catherine. Renee leaned in. Did she give you a name? Yes, Megan said. She said her name was Elaine. Elaine Wexler. Still alive in 1996. Still looking. And somehow, she had found her way into Everlite, or what Everlite used to be. That meant the network was still running into the 21st century. New name, new walls. Same purpose. The doctrine had not died, it had professionalized. With Megan's help, Renee reconstructed a timeline of facility transformations. The Asheville property had changed hands 7 times since 1982, but the inner structure, the chapel, the basements, the living quarters remained untouched in every blueprint. Some names in the ownership documents were repeated. One of them, Jeremiah R. Halcomb, CEO of a spiritual consultancy in Philadelphia. A. Public donor to several revivalist conferences. And the man whose initials matched every J.R. Signature traced back to the 1840s. It couldn't be the same man, but it could be the same family. Legacy of handlers. A dynasty of silence. In 2010, Renee attempted one final act, a public lecture at a small interfaith symposium in Atlanta. She presented her findings as fiction, a cautionary tale based on archival inspiration. She named no institutions, no people, just ideas. But someone recognized the pattern. A woman in the audience, elderly, in a gray shawl, approached her afterward and placed a small box in her hand. I kept this, she said. Since 1947, they said it was useless. But I remembered her. Inside was a silver cross, engraved with 3 initials, CEM, Catherine Elaine Morrison. And beneath it, folded neatly, a note. Not all vessels are broken. Some are filled with fire. Renee never published again. She completed her thesis in silence. Under a different topic. She now teaches high school literature in Maine, where she avoids public speaking and refuses interviews. But every year on March 11th, she lights a candle at midnight and places it in her window. She never says why, and never says for whom. But some say that, if you pass her house in that hour, you'll see 2 shadows, hers, and a second, a woman in white. The woman who stepped off the Greyhound bus in Clearfield, Pennsylvania, in the fall of 2023 was not famous, nor particularly remarkable at first glance. Her coat was secondhand, her suitcase small. She paid in cash. The only oddity was the charm she wore around her neck, a silver cross, engraved with CEM, and worn smooth at the edges by years of handling. Her name, according to the motel register, was Anna Morrow, but there is no record of such a woman before. That date. No social media. No school history. No digital footprint at all. Anna spent the next several weeks walking the outskirts of the old campgrounds. She took no photos, made no inquiries, and asked no questions. Locals assumed she was a student, or maybe just another lonely pilgrim drawn to the forest's quiet pull. But when one bartender asked what had brought her to such a forgotten place, she replied softly, "I'm looking for someone who left a candle burning." In December, she placed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Department of Interior, asking for access to restricted development files on the new Light Fellowship property. When denied, she appealed twice. On the third attempt, a single document slipped through, a 2002 topographical survey commissioned by a private security firm. Marked in red ink were underground cavities, some natural, some man-made, beneath the chapel's former location. One was labeled simply Subchamber Omega. It was never excavated. Never declassified, never explained. Anna took that map, traced its lines in pencil, and disappeared into the woods one last time. 3 days later, hikers found an opening that hadn't been there before fresh soil disturbed by frost and the cracked remains of a stone trapdoor. It led downward into a hollow sealed by time and roots. Inside, searchers found only dust, old wood, and silence, but scrawled across the back wall in something like charcoal or ash were the following words: "They tried to rewrite me, but I remember. Catherine was not alone. I am the last vessel." There was no sign of Anna Morrow, only her charm, left on the stone, glinting faintly in the light. What followed was an unraveling that no institution could stop. A young archivist at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, reviewing declassified land purchase records, cross-referenced Anna's name with past claims to the property. She found a pattern dozens of land parcels, cycling between private trusts and shell companies, many tracing back to a single financial firm in Philadelphia. The name of the majority shareholder? Jeremiah R. Halcomb III. 2 months later, the firm was dissolved, its records subpoenaed, and suddenly, a floodgate opened. A team of independent journalists, emboldened by the leak, began piecing together a century's worth of hidden documents rebranded. Facility names, altered census records, falsified obituaries. What emerged was staggering. Over 1,200 women, spanning from 1850 to 2020, had vanished from affiliated spiritual reform programs without trace. Dozens of clergy, institutional staff, and even state officials had connections to the renamed doctrine. Facilities operated under hundreds of aliases, from camps to wellness centers to correctional institutions. Survivors, long silent, came forward in coded online forums, in memoirs, in anonymous interviews. They described ritual erasure, names taken, identities scrubbed, purpose implanted. One survivor wrote, "They didn't want my body. They wanted my belief." Among the resurfaced files was a single-voice memo, dated 2010, pulled from a recovered recorder, believed to have belonged to Renee Thatcher. The voice was shaky, uncertain, but unmistakably determined. "They don't want you to remember because memory breaks the cycle. They call it elevation, but it's just disappearance in holy robes. The doctrine doesn't need a church anymore. It has buildings, grants, diagnostics. But still, it begins the same way. A girl, a promise, a vanishing. Pause. Tell them Catherine never left. She just scattered herself into stories." A congressional hearing was proposed, then tabled, then silenced again. Too many connections. Too much history. Instead, the investigation was redirected into a vague report on the misuse of religious authority in institutional settings. The phrase "new light" appeared only once, buried in a footnote. But not everything stayed buried. In 2025, a new podcast titled Where the Light Went climbed to the top of national charts. It was produced by a team of independent journalists, some of them descendants of women who had vanished, others former survivors themselves. It told the whole story, not the official one, the real one, episode by episode. It peeled back the layers. Catherine Morrison's mission, Martha Brennan's escape, Lydia Rowe's exile, Elaine Wexler's final journey, Renee Thatcher's flame-bearing scholarship, Anna Morrow's resurrection of memory. The doctrine could not sue. It had no name any more. Only smoke and ashes. And rumors. The final episode of the podcast featured a letter allegedly found buried in a steel box on the original New Light site beneath a rusted lantern. It read, "To whomever finds this, we were not saints. We were not servants. We were not vessels. We were women. And we were stolen. But you found us. You saw us. And so we live. Keep the light burning. That's all we ever wanted. MB, there are still places you can't find on maps. Names that don't appear in census records. Photographs with faces that seem too serene to be real. The doctrine has retreated again, fragmented, reformulated, hiding behind new grants, new organizations, new philosophies. But it fears one thing above all else, memory, because memory is truth's shadow, and truth can burn through even the thickest silence. So if you ever see a woman standing alone in a church's ruins, or a candle glowing in the window of a house far from town, or a phrase etched into a wall that doesn't belong there, stop. Read. Remember. Because she may be calling you not to worship. Not to obey, but to remember the names of those who were lost and to keep the flame alive.